Hello, listener. So I ran a poll on Twitter, and this time the definitive response was that I should do a science paper. So I have one here. The title is The Moral Stereotypes of Liberals and Conservatives. And I picked this one up because of well, I'd say it's well known, but maybe it's not so well known because what I consume in terms of information may be quite selective. But it's a paper that confirms the notion that conservatives generally do understand what liberals think and what their opinions are and what their positions are, whereas liberals generally have an extremely stereotyped view of conservatives and tend to just view them in moral terms as evil. So I'll read the paper and interject here and there when I think it's relevant, but mostly it's to just get this point across that conservatives have generally a more realistic image of what the political spectrum is like. So, the moral stereotypes of liberals and conservatives. Exaggeration of differences across the political divide. Deci Graham, Brian A. Nosek, and Jonathan Haidt. Published at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. First published April 5, 2012. Abstract. We investigated the moral stereotypes political liberals and conservatives have of themselves and each other. In reality, liberals endorse the individual-focused moral concerns of compassion and fairness more than conservatives do, and conservatives endorse the group-focused moral concerns of in-group loyalty, respect for authorities and tradition, and physical spiritual purity more than liberals do. US participants filed out the Moral Foundations questionnaire with their own answers, or as a typical liberal or conservative would answer. Across the political spectrum, moral stereotypes about typical liberals and conservatives correctly reflect the direction of actual differences in foundation endorsement, but exaggerated the magnitude of these differences. Contrary to common theories of stereotyping, the moral stereotypes were not simple underestimations of the political outgroup's morality. Both liberals and conservatives exaggerated the ideological extremity of moral concerns for the in-group as well as the out-group. But liberals were the least accurate of both groups. And we have a few quotes here to start with. The National Democratic Party is immoral to the core. Any American who would vote for Democrats is guilty of fostering the worst kind of degeneracy. The leaders of this party are severely out of touch with mainstream traditional American values. They are crusaders for perversion, for licentiousness, for nihilism, and worse. By Joseph Farr in 2003, WorldNet Daily. And the opposite quote. Republicans don't believe in the imagination, partly because so few of them have one, but mostly because it gets in the way of their chosen work, which is to destroy the human race and the planet. Human beings who have imaginations can see a recipe for disaster in the making. Republicans, whose goal in life is to profit from disaster and who don't give a hoot about human beings, either can't or won't. Michael Feingold, 2004, in Village Voice. Continuing the paper itself. For as long as there have been political rivalries, there have been unflattering stereotypes painted by each side about the other. These stereotypes go far beyond cliches about latte liberals and gun-rack conservatives. As the quotations above show, they often include the claim that the other side is moral or immoral or downright evil. Of course, evil is in the eye of the beholder, and liberal and conservative eyes seem to be tuned to different wavelengths of immorality. For conservatives, liberals have an anything-goes morality that says everything should be permitted for the sake of inclusion and diversity, no matter how bizarre or depraved. For liberals, conservatives lack basic moral compassion, especially for oppressed groups, and take a perverse joy in seeing the rich get richer while innocents suffer in poverty. These views may be caricatures, but they suggest that accusations of immorality may differ in content depending on the ideologies of the source and the target. In this paper we use moral foundations theory, Haidt and Graham, 2007, to investigate liberals and conservatives' moral stereotypes of themselves and each other. That is, their expectation about how strongly typical partisans would endorse values related to each of 5 intuitive moral foundations. Our study was designed to answer 3 questions. 1. How accurate are these moral stereotypes? 2. Are they exaggerations of real differences in moral values? 3. Where on the political spectrum do we find the greatest accuracy? Rather than examining general beliefs about the immorality of the other side, we sought a finer resolution of the moral domain to provide the first identification of patterns of inaccuracy for moral concerns. Exaggeration, inaccuracy, and stereotypes. Although the literature on stereotypes has tended to concentrate on biases and inaccuracies, several reviews have noted the accuracy of many social stereotypes in terms of real group differences, such as Judd and Park 2005, Jussim Harbour, Crawford, Kane, and Cohen in 2005, Ryan 2002. The notion that stereotypes could be exaggerations of actual group differences was popularized by Allport 1954, and The Nature of Prejudice, a stereotype is an exaggerated belief associated with a category. Stereotypes have long been thought of as motivated exaggerations both of stereotypical characteristics, Irish people are drunk every day, and in overgeneralization, every Irish person is drunk every day. A review by Macaulay, 1995, however, found only weak support for stereotypes as exaggeration as a general cognitive process. For instance, Macaulay and Stitt, 1978, found general accuracy with some underestimation of group differences when white students were asked to estimate characteristics of black students. I'll interject here. Interesting that it's whites who have a more positive view of blacks. That's what he's saying here. A general accuracy of underestimation of group differences. The white students thought the blacks were more alike to them than they actually were. Continuing. In the cases of racial, gender, and occupational groups, Macaulay reviews there may be motives to appear unprejudiced against outgroups, and these motives might counteract exaggeration tendencies. In cases where one does not wish to hide signs of intergroup hostility, motivational factors may have the opposite effect, increasing exaggeration and stereotyping. This brings us to politics, where people are quite willing to report their preferences for in-groups over out-groups. Nosek, Smith et al. In 2007. And sometimes even relish the opportunity. Social identity theory, Teifel and Turner, 1986, has been applied to political partisans, positing a motivation to maximize distinctions between the political in-group and out-group based on identifications with one's political party, Green, 2004. Examining the accuracy of stereotypes about the issue positions of Democrats and Republicans, Judd and Park found more exaggeration in the out-group versus in-group stereotypes of either side. Out-group stereotype exaggeration was stronger for those most identified with their in-group, suggesting that partisans of either side exaggerate more than moderates and centrists. Although this work made use of moral issues, we have found no studies looking specifically at the content of moral stereotypes, and how such stereotypes might be driven by the processes beyond simple partisan outgroup derogation. Moral stereotyping along 5 foundations. Moral foundation theory was created to identify the moral content areas most widely discussed in anthropological and evolutionary literatures. The theory posits 5 best candidates for being the psychological foundations upon which most moral virtues and institutions can be socially constructed. The first 2 foundations are harm versus care, involving intuitions of sympathy, compassion, and nurturance, fairness versus reciprocity, including notions of rights and justice. These 2 foundations are generally concerned with the protection and fair treatment of individuals, therefore called the 2 individualizing foundations. The other 3 foundations, in contrast, are called the binding foundations, because they underlie moral systems in which people are bound into larger groups and institutions. Note 1. These labels are not meant to imply that welfare and fairness concerns can never be group-focused, or that the others can never be individual-focused. Back to the main text. These foundations are in-group loyalty, in-group versus loyalty, supporting moral obligations of patriotism and us versus them thinking, authority versus respect, including concerns about traditions and maintaining social order, and purity versus sanctity, including moral disgust and spiritual concerns about treating the body as a temple. Graham, Haidt, and Nosek found that liberals endorsed the individualizing foundations more than conservatives did, whereas conservatives endorsed the binding foundations, in-group authority, purity, more than liberals did. This pattern has been observed across a variety of samples and methods, including self-report measures of unwillingness to violate the foundations for money, text analysis of sermons, and liberal and conservative churches, content coding of life narratives, and facial muscle movements. Cannon, Schnall, and White, 2011, Graham, Haidt in Press, McAdams et al., 2008, Van Leeuwen and Park, 2009. If this pattern is found so consistently, are people aware of these differences? Research on partisan stereotypes, Judd and Park, 1993, as well as research on naive realism and the culture war, Robinson, Keltner, Ward, and Ross, 1995, suggests that the 2 sides will overestimate their differences on specific issues. Might they likewise exaggerate differences in fundamental moral concerns, stereotyping their opponents as immoral or amoral monsters? Would these moral stereotypes be characterized by a general derogation of outgroup morality, or would there be more complexity or symmetry to the stereotypes? To examine the moral stereotypes that liberals and conservatives hold about each other, we took advantage of a method introduced by Dawes, Singer, and Lemons of having partisans indicate the values of typical partisan group members, allowing comparison of these projections with the partisans' actual answers. Participants completed multiple versions of the Moral Foundations questionnaire. One version asked participants for their own response. We refer to these as the actual scores. The other two versions asked participants to complete the MFQ as a typical liberal would or as a typical conservative would. We refer to these as the moral stereotype scores. These versions allow us to assess moral stereotypes about liberals and conservatives and to quantify their accuracy by comparing them to the responses people gave for themselves. Regarding our first research question, are moral stereotypes accurate? Because of the pervasiveness of actual liberal-conservative differences, we predicted that participants would, on average, correctly guess that liberals value the individualizing foundations more than conservatives do, and that conservatives value the binding foundations more than liberals do. Regarding our second question, are these stereotypes exaggerations of real group differences? We found only a weak evidence for general cognitive processes of stereotypes as exaggeration. We expected that the hostility between liberals and conservatives could create motivations to exaggerate the existing group differences. It is even possible that liberals and conservatives would exaggerate the moral concerns of their own group, not just the outgroup, perhaps as motivation to further distinguish their group from the other. Regarding our third question, who is most accurate, we find reason in the literature to generate three hypotheses among which we would hope to adjudicate. Hypothesis 1. Moderates are most accurate. Studies on ideological polarization, Chambers, Barron, and Iman 2006, Cohen 2003. The illogical extremity hypothesis, Orokia 1956, Tetlock 1984, Greenberg and Jonas 2003. And naive realism, Robinson et al. 1995. Suggest a symmetrical exaggeration of differences when liberals and conservatives try to look at the world through the eyes of the other. Partisans should distort equally, presumably underestimating their opponent's moral concerns, because both sides think the other side does not truly care about morality. On this view, political moderates should be the most accurate, morally stereotyping liberals and conservatives the least. Hypothesis 2. The liberals are the most accurate. Social psychological work on conservatism shows relations between conservatism or authoritarianism and mental rigidity, intolerance and close-mindedness. Similarly, Carter, 2006, found that acceptance of stereotyping was highest in individuals with conservative traits. These findings suggest that conservatives might be more threatened and less able to see the world from an alternate moral standpoint, and therefore more motivated to stereotype liberals than vice versa. Hypothesis 3. Conservatives most accurate. Moral foundations theory suggests that liberals may have a harder time understanding conservatives' morality than vice versa. If liberals don't intuitively feel what could be considered moral about in-group, racism for example, authority, oppression for example, and purity, sexual puritanism for example, then they may be forced to conclude that conservatives simply don't care about morality, specifically that conservatives don't care about harm and fairness, because they support policies that seem to hurt and cheat people for no morally good reason. Following the existing stereotype literature, we consider the first hypothesis to be the default prediction, meaning centrists have the most accurate view. If the results only show outgroup derogation by partisans about each other, then moral stereotypes are no different than other forms of stereotyping. However, if the results show asymmetrical inaccuracies, hypothesis 2 and 3, inaccuracies about the in-group as well as the out-group, or overestimations as well as underestimations of moral values, then this would suggest that moral stereotypes involve novel psychological processes beyond the well-understood intergroup stereotyping, driving exaggeration of out-group characteristics. I will skip the methodology part of the paper, which is just about how many participants, the N, what methods, etc., etc. The results. We measured and analyzed accuracy at the level of moral foundations subscores, aggregates of 4 to 5 items each. This allowed us to capture accuracy in terms of mean foundational concerns, as well as relative rankings of the foundations. For the 10 MFQ subscores, 5 foundations measured by relevance and judgment subskills, we compared we compared predicted moral stereotype scores as answered as a typical liberal or as a typical conservative to 4 criteria. A. The actual liberal conservative means in the current sample. B. The actual means for extreme liberal conservatives in the current sample. C. The actual liberal to conservative means in the representative sample. And D. The actual means for extreme liberal, extreme conservatives in the representative sample. As an example, the mean harm relevance score for all participants answering as a typical conservative was 2.46, with a standard deviation of 1.11. The actual mean of conservative in the sample was 3.43, SD 0.95, meaning that people on average underestimated how morally relevant conservatives would find harm concerns. We compared such overall moral stereotype scores, using the entry sample, as well as the moral stereotypes held by liberals, moderates and conservatives separately. Means and statistics for all comparisons, 10 foundation subscores answered as a typical liberal and typical conservative compared to 4 comparison criteria, are available in Table 1 and a supplemental spreadsheet. The spreadsheet calculates if D, F and D for each comparison, see example above, using formulas that do not assume equal variances or numbers. Below we present meta-analytic summaries of these comparisons. We organize the results around answers to questions. These 3 central questions are: 1. Are the moral stereotypes accurate with regard to the direction of liberal-conservative differences in the foundations? Yes. For both relevance and judgment items, answers as a typical liberal yielded higher scores on harm and fairness than answers as a typical conservative, and lower scores on in-group authority and purity. These showed directional accuracy compared to the real group differences found both in this study and in previous research. Liberals endorse individual-focused moral concerns more than conservatives do, and conservatives endorse group-focused moral concerns more than liberals do. 2. Are these stereotypes exaggerations of the real group differences? Yes. Figure 1 shows the average conservative-liberal differences for each foundation comparing the moral stereotypes, answered as typical partisans, to the actual differences found in our 4 comparison criteria. Current sample mean, current sample extremes, representative sample means, representative sample extremes. For all of the measures, foundation differences were similar across formats, relevance and judgment. And so for clarity of presentation, the 2 MFQ subscales are combined in Figure 1. Differences were calculated as follows. The overall moral foundation means for answered as typical liberal version were subtracted from the overall means for the same scores answered as a typical conservative. Differences between the actual mean of liberals and conservatives and between the actual means of extreme liberals and extreme conservatives were calculated the same way, see Table 2. As both the top panel and comparison to current sample and bottom panel comparison to representative sample of Figure 1 show, moral stereotypes exaggerated the liberal-conservative differences in line with moral foundation theory. Not only were the moral stereotypes about typical partisans more different from each other, average absolute difference 1.41 with a range of 0.58 to 2.12, than the actual MFQ scores of liberals and conservatives, average absolute difference 0.57, range 0.12 to 1.41. They were as different or even more so than the actual scores of extreme partisans. Average absolute difference 0.98, range 0.06 to 1.91, see Table 2. That is, participants' belief about the typical liberal and conservative were even more polarized than the actual polarization between extreme liberals and conservatives, meaning moderates had a far more distorted view of both sides. Who is most accurate? It depends on the type of morality. Comparisons to actual group means were also made separately for the moral stereotypes held by liberals, moderates and conservatives. This allows us to address our 3rd research question about who is most accurate when answering as a typical liberal or typical conservative. Statistics and effect sizes for each of these comparisons, the 3 groups moral stereotypes about typical liberals and conservatives compared to the 4 actual group criteria for 5 foundations, gouged by relevance and judgment measures were calculated. Here we meta-analytically summarize the comparisons using ranges and averages of effect sizes, gauging accuracy in terms of differences from the current sample means, and using only items common to both datasets, the representative sample means. One moment, I will have a bit of water. (3a) Conservatives were most accurate about the individual-focused moral concerns of either side, and liberals were least accurate. Compared to actual group means of either dataset, moral stereotypes about the typical conservative showed substantial underestimation of conservatives' harm and fairness concerns. Liberals tended to underestimate the most, average 34.55, but they too underestimated their own group's harm and fairness concerns in every comparison with actual conservative scores. Stereotypes about the harm and fairness concerns of the typical liberal tended to be more accurate as compared to actual liberal scores in the two datasets. Here again, conservatives were the most accurate, only slightly underestimating liberal individualizing concerns, average 0.08 deviation, followed by moderates who underestimated slightly more, average 0.12 deviation. Liberals were the least accurate about their own group's individualizing concerns, overestimating them on average, average 0.40 deviation. 3b. Moderates were most accurate about the group-focused moral concerns of either side, and liberals were least accurate. Stereotypes about the in-group authority and purity concerns of typical conservatives tended to be overestimations compared to the actual group means in both datasets. Here again, liberals were the least accurate, overestimating conservative binding concerns the most, average deviation 0.55, followed by conservatives who also overestimated their own group's binding concerns, average deviation 0.34. Moderates were the most accurate, with an average deviation of 0.28, but they too overestimated the binding concerns when answering as a typical conservative. Stereotypes about the typical liberal, on the other hand, tended to underestimate the binding moral concerns about actual liberals reported. Here again, liberals were the least accurate, underestimating their own binding concerns the most, average deviation 0.62, followed by conservative with an average deviation of 0.46. Moderates were the most accurate, but also underestimated the binding concerns when answering as a typical liberal, deviation of 0.17. Liberals exaggerate moral differences the most, 0.3c. Sorry, let me start that over. 3c. Liberals exaggerate moral differences the most. Means for the three groups' moral stereotypes about the typical liberal and typical conservative are shown compared to the real group means in figure 2. As both of the top panels, current sample comparison, and both of the bottom panels, representative sample comparison, show, participants across the political spectrum tended to exaggerate the liberal-conservative differences as evidenced by the steeper slopes of the prediction lines as compared to the actual lines. This exaggeration of differences is an effect of overestimating liberals' individualizing concerns and underestimating their binding concerns, and overestimating conservatives' binding concerns and underestimating their individualizing concerns. All four panels of figure 2 show that liberals exaggerate differences the most. Lines representing moral stereotypes held by liberals have the steepest slopes. The figure also shows that the largest inaccuracies were liberal underestimations of the individualizing concerns of the typical conservative. Overall exaggeration of moral differences, operationalized as overestimating conservative binding concerns, underestimating conservative individualizing concerns, and doing the opposite for liberals, is plotted across the full logical spectrum in figure 3. So let me just summarize this. Liberals have the least accurate view because they tend to think of their own group as being more concerned with the harm and fairness values than they actually are. So you could say that, for example, the typical SJW views himself as the typical morality for liberals, whereas that they are actually on the extreme. So they hold atypical moral values for liberals, although all liberals have more care for harm and fairness values than authority and in-group preference values that conservatives do. The average liberal is not that deviated as the extremist like the SJW is. But the most liberals, they exaggerate how caring their own position is, and they also exaggerate how authoritarian and in-group preferent conservatives are. Meaning they have a distorted view of both their own side and of the conservative side of things. And conservatives have an inaccurate view of liberals, less inaccurate than liberals have of themselves, and they do have a generally good view of their own group. So conservatives understand themselves, they know exactly what their values and moral types are, and they slightly stereotype liberals as latte sipping soy boys. But less so than liberals do in the opposite side. So, carrying on with the text. Discussion. Results indicate that people at all points on the political spectrum are at least intuitively aware of the actual differences in moral concerns between liberals and conservatives. They correctly predicted that liberals would care more than conservatives about the two individualizing foundations and that conservatives would care more than liberals about the three binding foundations. The results also confirm previous studies of partisan misperceptions, e.g. Chambers et al. 2006, by showing that, in general, people overestimate how dramatically liberals and conservatives differ. Remarkably, people even morally stereotype their own in-group, with liberals overestimating liberals' strong individualizing concerns and underestimating liberals' weak binding concerns, and conservatives exaggerating conservatives' moral concerns in the opposite direction. Our results go beyond previous studies, however, in finding and explaining an otherwise puzzling result. Liberals were the least accurate. We presented three competing hypotheses about accuracy. We found no support for the hypothesis that liberals would be most accurate. Liberals were the least accurate about conservatives and about liberals. The largest inaccuracies were in liberals' underestimations of conservatives' harm and fairness concerns, and liberals further exaggerated the political differences by overestimating their own such concerns. We found some support for the hypothesis that moderates would be most accurate, which they were in the case of the binding foundations. However, and most crucially, partisan inaccuracies were not mirror images of each other, in which case the red and blue lines in figure 2 would have opposite slopes. On the contrary, liberals and conservatives both tended to exaggerate their binding foundations differences by underestimating the typical liberal and overestimating the typical conservative. Finally, we found some support for the hypothesis that conservatives would be the most accurate, which they were in the case of the individualizing foundations. In line with moral foundations theory, liberals dramatically underestimated the harm and fairness concerns of conservatives. These findings add to the literature on moral foundations by demonstrating a novel form of pragmatic validity. For the theory, conceptualizing and measuring the moral stereotypes have of different social groups. Another sip of water. While we obtained a nationally representative sample for comparison of MFQ scores, I'll note here, by the way, the N for this study was over 2,200 people, so it can't be criticized for having a low N. I'll carry on with the text. It is important to note that the predicted answers as typical liberals versus conservatives all come from a non-representative project implicit sample. However, the participants in this study do run the gamut across the ideological spectrum, from very liberal to very conservative. And figure 3 demonstrates exaggeration across all 7 points on the political orientation item. Extreme liberals exaggerated the moral political differences the most, and moderate conservatives did so the least. Further, Nosek, and J, 2009, showed evidence that strong conservatives at Project Implicit were as much pro-conservative candidates, both implicitly and explicitly, as strong liberals were pro-liberal candidates. Finally, across Project Implicit studies, the liberal and conservative extremes show equivalent or near equivalent extremity in implicit and explicit liking and identity with partisan parties, politicians and positions. Nevertheless, we cannot completely rule out reference effects in these predictions based on non-representative sampling. In particular, while the conservatives in this sample are indeed conservative, they may also have different social experiences than representative conservatives. For example, conservatives who live in urban, predominantly liberal enclaves might have greater insight into liberal beliefs than conservatives who live in rural or predominantly conservative enclaves. A useful follow-up investigation would examine the effect of exposure to liberals and conservatives in one's social context. If this is impactful and if the present sample is systematically skewed in this regard, then accounting for social context may qualify the present conclusion of conservatives having greater accuracy than liberals. The ideological culture war in the United States is, in part, an honest disagreement about ends, moral values that each side wants to advance, as well as an honest disagreement about means, laws and policies, to advance those ends. But our findings suggest that there is an additional process at work. Partisans on each side exaggerate the degree to which the other side pursues moral ends that are different from their own. Much of this exaggeration comes from each side underestimating the degree to which the other side shares its own values. I'll interrupt here to note, this study was published in 2012, so the culture war was a thing and had been a thing since the 90s, but I think that they should, if they made the study today, they should maybe revise the fact and view what sort of extreme policies are being pushed these days. You can't say that, oh, actually, people aren't as different as the partisan figureheads make it out to be. Conservatives and liberals are actually quite close to each other. When the liberals are busy pushing transgender children and gay pride parades full with drag queens and so on as being normal, and the conservatives are just haven't shifted. They've just stayed in their place, the traditional values. So I'd say that the perception of how extreme the opposite side is has grown to be more and more accurate because some sides have become much more extreme. Anyway, carry on with the text. Some of it comes unexpectedly from overestimating the degree to which typical members of one's own side endorse its values. Studies of in-group stereotypes tend to show that they are more accurate and less exaggerated than stereotypes about an out-group, especially for higher status groups like whites. However, the current study found that moral stereotypes about an ideological group can be just as exaggerated when held by in-group members as by out-group members, and sometimes even more so. We suspect that this is partially due to the fact that one can imagine members of one's own ideological group more extreme than oneself. People could in fact be motivated to differentiate themselves from their ideological group, imagining typical group members to be more extreme in their moral profile. But this may also be a unique feature of moral stereotypes, in that people are motivated to exaggerate the moral values of their group in ways that are in line with those same values. The asymmetrical pattern found in moral stereotypes about the individualizing foundations fits remarkably well with recent work on ideological opponent and own group misperception. Examining co-perceptions of conflicting groups such as pro-life, pro-choice, and Hawks-Dobbs, Chambers and Malink, 2006, found that partisans saw their adversaries as motivated by an opposition to their own core values, rather than being motivated by promotion of the adversary's values. This is consistent with the moral stereotypes that liberals appear to have of conservatives. Liberals see conservatives as being motivated by an opposition to liberals' core values of compassion and fairness, as well as being motivated by their own non-moral values of in-group loyalty, respect for authority and tradition, and spiritual purity. This misperception is asymmetrical. Conservatives did underestimate liberal moral concerns with the binding foundations, but they were no more likely to underestimate than liberals themselves. It is striking that instead of basic partisan outgroup derogation, in which both sides predict that the other is less moral, or more evil in general, we found foundation-specific moral stereotypes about liberals and conservatives, and these moral stereotypes were largely shared by all. Participants across the political spectrum exaggerated liberal moral disregard for in-group authority and purity, and conservative disregard for harm and fairness, that is, exaggerations of the patterns predicted by moral foundations theory. This suggests that moral stereotypes might be unique in that they are motivated, partisans want to cast the other side as immoral, and yet partisans share the same moral stereotypes about either side. Even more surprising, they share both of these moral stereotypes with moderates, who are presumably not as motivated to stereotype either side. More research is needed to further delineate more moral stereotypes of political partisans, for instance, to see if moral stereotypes about members of political parties mirror those about the ideological groups, both in two-party political systems like the US and in multi-party systems like Italy. We also hope that future studies can use moral foundations theory's final resolution of the moral domain to investigate specific moral stereotypes along other social groupings, such as race, gender, social class, age, and weight. Chambers and Melnick, 2006, conclude partisan group members suffered a misapprehension that their adversaries worked to actively and willfully oppose their own sides' interests, rather than promoting the values that are central to their adversary's doctrine. It is this perception that may spawn the feelings of distrust and animosity that partisans feel toward their rivals and may ultimately fuel conflict between partisan groups. In this study, we focused on the moral values of ideological opponents and their perception of moral values of either side, in order to understand the moral distrust and animosity endemic to the liberal-conservative culture war. We found that there are real moral differences between liberals and conservatives, but people across the political spectrum exaggerate the magnitude of these differences and in so doing create opposing moral stereotypes that are shared by all. Calling attention to this unique form of stereotyping and to the fact that liberal and conservative moral values are less polarized than most people think could be effective ways of reducing the distrust and animosity of current ideological divisions. And that's the end of the study. I think the results of this study confirm what anyone who has spent some time thinking about it would have imagined to be the case, that liberals have a fairly inaccurate worldview and that they have no idea what the actual opinion of conservatives is, and conservatives have a slightly exaggerated opinion of what liberals think. What is interesting about the partisan thing is that the perception that the opposing side isn't so much out to build something based on their own values, but more out to destroy our values. Now, I have that perception very much. I view leftists and as in general being some form of Marxist and neoliberals and so on. And in my opinion, they are more actively busy with their own greed and destroying what came before than actually building anything. I mean, gay prides, homosexual marriage, child drag queens, transgender surgeries, all that stuff, mass migration, destroying the economy by through subsidy, over taxation, and over regulation, and so on. Most of that comes across as willfully ignorant and willfully malicious to me. But I am definitely an extreme partisan on the far right. I could hardly deny that. So I do view them as willfully malicious, and I've seen very little to convince me of that otherwise. I'll note that this study is of course done in the United States, where certain ideological differences are more rooted in society, and there has been a longer process of ideological shift between the population. So, although you would expect these results to somewhat translate to European countries, I think that there would be a difference in how skewed the perception of each other is. Although I do think that the fact that leftists have a more skewed worldview does hold up, because if you have a discussion with a leftist, whether that's in the Netherlands, Germany, the US, you generally find out that they don't have a very good image of what your worldview is as a conservative and why you think the things you are. They just think you're racist and oppressive, and rather than being like in favor of your own people and culture and traditions and so on for any good reason. Anyway, I'll end it there.